Chinese economy in an apples-to-apples comparison using similar GDP calculation methodology, the Chinese economy is 75% larger than the United States. Where they have to start asking, was my understanding of this problem actually wrong this whole time?
Later.
外网一直有一种极其可笑的幻觉，那就是只要美元霸权还在，美国的经济就永远天下第一。但现实世界根本不认这种虚无的金融魔法。一位外国学者最近做了一个极其扎心的测算，他把美国 GDP 那些靠看病、打官司和金融炒作凑出来的数字全部扔掉，只对比中美两国真正造出来的工业品和基建。这个去伪存真的动作，直接撕下了美国经济体量的遮羞布。剥离掉通胀和金融水分后，中国真实的实体经济规模已经是美国的2倍还要多。西方精英脑海中那个落后的中国，早就变成了他们根本无法直视的工业巨兽。来看影片。
So about a year ago, I did a video about GDP methodology and the differences between Chinese GDP methodology and the United States methodology, and I came to the conclusion that if you calculated the US GDP in the same way that you calculate Chinese GDP, US GDP falls to $21 trillion. And at the time, China's GDP, for the numbers that I was using, was like 18 to 18.5 trillion at the time. So, what that meant at the time was that if you were to convert this now to purchasing power parity, since purchasing power parity normalizes to the US dollar, the US GDP doesn't move, but the Chinese economy does still move, and it moves up to, I don't know, it was 35 or 37 trillion, whatever the number was, and that represented roughly a 75% larger than the US situation at the time. In terms of like real material on the ground economy, the Chinese economy in an apples to apples comparison using similar GDP calculation methodology, the Chinese economy is 75% larger than the United States in any real sense. So, I just looked at the same problem again, and it's now a year later, give or take. And Chinese purchasing power parity GDP is 43.5 trillion. And, you know, the United States, doesn't really shift a lot in terms of, where its GDP collapses to. In large part because most of the growth that we see in our GDP is financial, and that's not something that they count. So even if we're seeing growth, most of that growth is shown in things that just shouldn't be counted, really. In terms of like, if the point of GDP is to tell us something about the material standards of a country, then counting finance charges or counting the excess expenditure of health insurance and all these other things, they don't give us a good idea of what living there is actually like for people, like what their material standard of living is. So if we're looking at it now, the Chinese economy, using that same broad framework, is now over twice as large as the United States. And it's gained 25% on the United States in just a short period of time. And why is it growing so quickly? Well, there's a number of factors. Firstly, the Chinese economy, in just straight nominal percentage, is growing faster than the United States, growing twice as fast or even 3 times as fast as the United States, right there. But then also, the United States is experiencing wild inflation for several years running. Maybe not wild, it's high though. It's historically high. It's not the highest inflation we've ever seen, but it's not nothing either. And so that's affecting the purchasing power parity calculation, because what a dollar buys in the United States is lower. But at the same time, the Chinese economy is experiencing either very minimal, no, or even deflation, right? So like they're having negative inflation, and we're having a magnitude-wise a fairly large inflation number. So that's also affecting the PPP equation. That's a lot of P's. And what that means is what a dollar buys in China today versus what a dollar bought in China a year ago is the same or more than it was, right? In the United States, a dollar today buys significantly less than it bought a year ago. So when you couple that with the growth, and also they have growth and deflation at the same time, it's breaking our understanding. And I think there's a point worth talking about here. I'm starting to see even like liberals, like hardcore liberals, like Ezra Klein, these types of people, they're starting to admit that perhaps they were wrong materially about what China actually looks like on the ground, okay? So when people imagine China, they often, especially Westerners, when they imagine China, they often imagine a China of 30 years ago or more. They imagine, dirty, hard scrabble conditions, like they imagine a picture that hasn't actually existed meaningfully in most parts of China for decades. And they're coming to the realization that that is not true, that China is actually significantly materially more advanced than they ever thought it was. And it's kind of breaking people. It's breaking their understanding. It's forcing people into a dark corner of cognitive dissonance where they have to start asking, was my understanding of this problem actually wrong this whole time? But what I find really funny about it is that same level of reflection is not ever extended to their understanding of Chinese governance. That maybe, perhaps, if their material picture of China on the ground was this wrong, that perhaps also that means that maybe their understanding of Chinese governance might also be equally wrong. But that conversation isn't being had yet. They're still imagining the same like totalitarian view of China that they assumed for the last 30 years. They're imagining now that there's this large, fairly wealthy, repressed population in the most clean and advanced country in the world. Clean might be a stretch. China's got a lot of cleanup to do, but they're making amazing strides in that space. Anyway, I think what makes this a really interesting conundrum, on top of the fact that I just think it's interesting how much ground China is growing, but that's also a critical part of the point I'm trying to make. They're gaining ground invisibly and very rapidly. Like, people aren't quite aware. As far as I know, I'm the only one who's asking this question. I've never heard anybody else make this argument ever, that if you calculate the GDP in equivalent ways and then compare them purchasing power parity, that you end up with a very different picture than any other way that people are comparing these two countries. But because nobody's looking at this, what I'm seeing at least is that the growth is invisible, firstly, and massive. The change that's taking place, the rate at which the change is taking place, is really fucking crazy. And if I had to give it an analogy, I would say that, like, it's a lot like a seismic pressure on a fault line, right? Like, there's all this pressure building up on these two plates that are, rubbing up against each other, and it hasn't moved yet, but sometime in the relatively near future, they're gonna slip, and it's gonna be a fucking earthquake.
Later.
众所周知，美国的 GDP 数字常年霸占全球第一，但仔细掰开揉碎了看，里面塞满了各种让人啼笑皆非的社会摩擦成本。这位老外学者所说的几竿水分，其实在我们普通人的日常生活里有着最直观的体现。我们可以通过几个极其真实的现实切面，来看看美国这庞大的经济体量到底是怎么凑出来的。首先是最致命的医疗账单，在美国，普通人哪怕只是叫一次救护车，做一次最基础的阑尾炎手术，就能轻轻松松为美国 GDP 贡献几万美元的经济增长。而在中国，同样的救治过程，同样的身体康复结果，只会产生几千块人民币的费用。从 GDP 的账面上看，美国这项医疗活动的经济价值是中国的几十倍，但老百姓实际得到的物理结果完全一样，就是一个健康的身体。 美国靠着天价的医疗账单把经济数据吹得震天响，背后的代价却是无数普通人因此背上了沉重的医疗债务。其次是基础设施建设的真实账本。美国纽约修建第二大道地铁线，短短2-3公里的路程，不仅修了10几年，还烧掉了几十亿美元。这些天文数字全都被算进了美国的 GDP 里，但其中大部分的钱根本没有变成钢筋水泥，而是变成了没完没了的环境评估报告费、无休止的法庭诉讼费，以及各种咨询公司的天价服务费。对比之下，中国很多2线城市花同样的钱，早就建成了覆盖全城几十公里的地下轨道交通网。美国把内部的扯皮和行政虚耗算成了经济繁荣，而中国算的是实打实跑在轨道上的列车。还有那些极其荒谬的法律摩擦成本。在美国社会，哪怕是一个轻微的交通事故，或者企业之间的一点小摩擦，都会衍生出庞大的律师费和诉讼费。美国拥有极其庞大的送棍群体，他们不生产任何实体商品，只是在社会财富的左右手倒腾中疯狂抽成，而这些抽成同样被全额计入了美国的 GDP。这种纯粹的社会内耗，在中国的统计标准和现实社会中被压缩到了最低。老百姓把钱花在刀刃上，而不是用来养活庞大的律师群体。最后是最直观的日常物价。过去几年，美国严重的通货膨胀，让一顿最普通的快餐套餐也卖到了10几美元。这10几美元吃进去的卡路里，和中国街边10几20块人民币的一顿外卖没有任何区别。但在美国的 GDP 统计表上，这顿饭的经济价值又被凭空放大了好几倍。1张美元能买到的真实商品越来越少，华盛顿的政客们却拿着因为通胀而膨胀的 GDP 数据向选民疯狂邀功。这份直白的测算结果，残酷地揭示了高度金融化经济的脆弱。拨开那些被刻意吹大的经济气球，中国的实体经济展现出了一种绝对的结构性优势。真正的优越感，从来不是华尔街大屏幕上跳动的绿色数字，而是工厂里源源不断下线的工业品，是老百姓不用担心破产就能看得起病，是用极其亲民的价格就能买到的丰富物质。中国选择了一条最为艰难却最稳妥的实体制造之路，这让整个国家在面对外部风险时，拥有了西方难以企及的韧性。